This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Canna Health.
What if you had such a clear understanding of your own DNA and genetic makeup that you could make informed decisions about what type of cannabis products interact best with your system? Well, now you can with EndoDNA. EndoDNA is a simple DNA test that maps your entire endocannabinoid system and then matches that summary with the specific cannabinoid ratio and terpene profile that's aligned with your unique genotype. Imagine being armed with personal information when visiting a dispensary. You'll have the knowledge and capability to purchase products that best aligns with your genotype. Visit their website to purchase the EndoDNA collection kit and Endo Decoded report at endodna.com/products and use the promo code CONNECT15 for a 20% discount. Again, that website is endodna.com/products and you use the promo code CONNECT15 for a 20% discount. The future of cannabinoid therapeutics is here with EndoDNA. Hello, my fellow people of the plant. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Cannabinoid Connect podcast, your favorite podcast that includes industry-facing conversations with the industry's leading experts that aim to educate and inform the public regarding the plant's endless benefits. My guest today is Javier Martinez. He's the New Mexico State Representative and co-sponsor of House Bill 12. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special guest today, and it's very timely. We have New Mexico State Representative and co-sponsor of House Bill 12, which is the Cannabis Regulation Act, Javier Martinez, on the show today. How are you, Javier?
Hi, I'm doing all right. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for making time for me and my audience today.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I mentioned the word timely because, as we've been reading with different articles, like, for Marijuana Moment, for example, has been really good on covering what's happening in New Mexico, as well as some of the other states that are in the process of voting for adult use cannabis. And so I know that New Mexico is in overtime right now. I know that y'all were working hard during the legislative session to get something on the governor's desk for signing. But she's called a special session now where it's kind of overtime and you guys are working, I think, tomorrow to meet and get this thing done. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, we start tomorrow at noon and hopefully it will not take us more than a couple of days.
Awesome. Well, I particularly have had an eye on the legislative session in New Mexico, specifically related to the cannabis, legalization efforts that are being met right now. And so, I'm a New Mexico native, right? And I know that this topic has come up before. So, Representative Javier, why don't you talk about kind of your background, what made you become so passionate about cannabis and cannabis legalization? And then a brief history of kind of New Mexico and where they've stood as it relates to legalization of cannabis in the state.
Yeah, well, I come to this work really from my own personal experience. I grew up along the border. I was born in El Paso and raised in Juarez. My entire family is from the Juarez, Chihuahua area. And so, I come to this work from the perspective that the war on drugs has been an utter failure. The war on drugs has cost the people of not only this country, but other countries, incredible amounts of money, lives lost, tragically, lives changed forever, intergenerationally, simply because this country, 60, 70 years ago, made some policy decisions at the national level that were really rooted in racism, and that, for one reason or another have survived way past their time. There's a fantastic book that really got me thinking about the war on drugs in a much more nuanced way. The name of the book is Chasing the Scream by Johan Hari. And he's a journalist who himself became addicted to substances, particularly heroin. It's one of these situations where you have a surgery and you are prescribed painkillers, and one thing leads to another. Next thing you know, you are using black tar heroin in his case, right? And so he really dives deep in the book about the why. Why do we treat drug addiction the way we do? And it's a fascinating read for anyone who is interested in understanding why we view not only cannabis, but many of these other drugs through a criminal justice lens and not through a public health lens. Now, getting back to my own experience, even though, I have been fortunate not to have experienced violence personally, I do have family members, cousins and relatives and whatnot who have been impacted by this violence. And in most of those cases, they were innocent bystanders, going from point A to point B, and they were caught in a crossfire. They were caught in a, whatever type of situation they were caught up in. And so to me, as our society shifts its understanding of drugs, particularly cannabis, and also understanding that cannabis is one of the largest cash crops for these drug cartels. It's imperative on us to make sure that we do what's smart from a policy perspective, while at the same time taking advantage of what could potentially be a game-changing industry for a state like New Mexico that is overly dependent on the oil and gas industry. So, that's how I come to the work. I'll be very honest with you. I've used cannabis a handful of times. I've never really liked it. I think I was like any other high schooler out there who smoked with friends at a park one time, and I did not really particularly enjoy it. I don't grow cannabis. I'm not a connoisseur. I couldn't tell you plant A from plant B. I don't have any type of business interest or any relatives with business interest in this industry. I'm just in it because I believe that this is my way to contribute to ending this war on drugs. And obviously, New Mexico is a small state. New York State's about to or just recently legalized. Those states, California, New York, those are game changers. Texas, once Texas legalizes, those are game changers, right? New Mexico's still a little speck on the map, but it's our way to contribute to destigmatizing this plant, and to really improve our understanding of what cannabis is and what it's not.
Right. And I would give you, more credit. In terms of you saying a little speck, I get, the population size of New Mexico compared to a state like California or Texas or New York. But to your point, like every state that's talking about this or advocating or is moving the needle, right? To destigmatize and address a lot of those racial issues that have been imposed on people of color over the years, right? Through criminalization and prohibition and other things. And I agree with you that, the war on drugs has been a failure, right? Because they didn't do their due diligence to really understand what each drug does or how it impacts a human being, right? It seems like they kind of just clumped everything into Schedule 1. And people who have any type of experience with cannabis, like even yourself, who's not a daily consumer, right? But you have experience, that the substance is not physically addicting. It's not, so of course you want to be of age to do it where your brain is in the right, space, but there's no physical harm compared to like what methamphetamine or heroin would do, right?
That's absolutely right. And, there's also not the physical harm that results from tobacco use or even alcohol. That's been, I think, widely studied and published. It's not the same type of chemical reaction in your body. We had a presentation in one of our legislative committees a couple of years ago. And in order for an individual to overdose from cannabis consumption, you've got to consume something like 400 times your body weight.
Right, 400,000. Yeah, it's
impossible,
physically impossible to do. Right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, but you could easily overdose, on a bottle of, cheap vodka. It happens all the time, sadly, right? So it is very different things, but the way we've treated, and even the way we refer to it, right? The term marijuana itself has very, very real racial undertones, and there's a reason why it's called that, in the federal statutes.
So you know what, Representative Javier, I actually thought that I was educated in the last episode that I had with Amos Lozano. He's a hemp operator out of San Antonio, and I thought the same thing, that it was, there was a racial undertone. It was a term that was made by the federal government, but and I'm gonna butcher his whole explanation, but basically, like, it was a term used with the Native Americans that were in the U.S. before the Europeans came and colonized, and they kind of tweaked the word. It was marijuana is what they used initially, but they tweaked the word a little bit to make it more friendly, and then over time the government used that and kind of demonized it. But
Mm.
its origin, I always thought that it was made up, but its origin is actually pure from a native kind of indigenous tribe, that was here before the settlers came. So just a
Very interesting. Thanks for that background.
yeah, man. So I just wanted to call that out because he schooled me the other day. So let's get right into it. So I know that in the special session come tomorrow, right? Today is what, the 29th of March. So the 30th, y'all will meet. I know that there's multiple bills that have been brought back into the discussion, right? I mean, HB 12, which is the bill that you're co-sponsoring, passed the House, went on to the Senate. There were some amendments that were made, and there couldn't be a resolution that was met. So that's why this special session has been called. But now there's other bills that are introduced. So let's talk a little bit first about HB 12 and the components of that bill, and then maybe some of the competing bills that are also coming to the forefront as well, and the differences between those.
Yeah, so during the special session, mechanically the way it works is the governor will place items on the call. These are the things that she wants us to consider. It is very possible that it is our version of House Bill 12 that makes it on the call, and it is very possible that the other proposal does not. So we may not even have quote unquote competing proposals come tomorrow. Still to be determined, but that's a possibility. House Bill 12 really is a bill that has been evolving since 2015. This legislation used to be known as the Cannabis Freedom Act. And former state representative Bill McCamley, who used to represent a community down in southern New Mexico in the city of Las Cruces, was the first person to carry that. And there's also a senator, Senator Jerry Ortiz-Pino, who's actually we share some precincts. He's in Albuquerque as well. And he's been a long-time fighter for cannabis legalization as well. That Cannabis Freedom Act really is the starting point that leads us to House Bill 12. We have tweaked that bill. We have improved on it. The bill has never deviated itself from its core components of smart regulatory and tax authority, protections for the medical cannabis program, and concerted efforts to ensure social justice as we bring this new industry into the forefront. We've made some tweaks along the way as we've debated the bills in committees and whatnot, and as we have worked with advocates throughout to improve on it. The bill now is really since the 60-day session, which ended about a week ago, we've actually made some changes to it based on what we heard in committees. And so the bill that will be introduced tomorrow will reflect some of those changes as well.
And can you speak to those changes? Like you mentioned the three that have evolved since the bill was first introduced in 2015. You mentioned the taxation, protection of the medical patients, and then the addressing the social equity and restorative justice component. So have any of those, since the bill was passed last by the House, what changes have been made?
One of the biggest changes that we made from House Bill 12 to the bill that will be introduced tomorrow is a plant and license management system within the Regulation and Licensing Department, which is the agency in New Mexico that would be in charge of creating the Cannabis Control Division, and that will handle all things cannabis in the state of New Mexico. In the previous iteration of the bill, we did not have a plant count or cap, I should say, and we did not have a license cap either. I personally don't believe it's good policy to get a new industry rolling and sort of setting these artificial caps. Some of the competing bills had artificial caps, right? They had X number of plants, X number of licenses. We ended up working with staff at the regulation and licensing department, and we came up with a concept that for the first 3 years, in collaboration with economists from our School of Business here at the University of New Mexico, that they would determine a plant count and a license cap for those first 3 years to ensure market equilibrium. After those 3 years, then that system would phase out, and then we would essentially have an open free market system where you would grow as much as you can sell, the way we treat other agricultural products in the state of New Mexico. There's no cap on hatch green chili. You grow what you can sell, right? And if you're overgrowing, you're probably not going to sell it. It's probably, you would have learned that lesson. The next year, you're not going to overgrow anymore, right? Although That's a terrible example because hatch green chili always sells out,
That's
as
right.
you know. But that's one of the bigger changes that we have in the bill. Aside from that change,
so just to dive deeper into that, so that's basically, like, in just kind of layman's terms, it's just a proof of concept type approach where you are capped and there are limited number of licenses, I guess, initially, or is it just the plant count, and then after that 3 years, then it's kind of unlimited?
Yeah, so picture it this way, right? So come September 1st, the Cannabis Control Division would begin issuing essentially what are producer licenses, so that folks can start growing. Come January 1, they would give out other types of licenses that are associated with the industry, such as manufacturing licenses and courier licenses, because you need folks who are going to deliver, cannabis plants from a farm somewhere to a warehouse facility in another city, for example, in New Mexico. And so you want to make sure that there's a licensing process for those folks. Those will all happen January 1. And then sales would begin roughly on or about April 1st. After that point in time, the division, with the support of an advisory board that would be set up, and like I said, with the support of our research institution here in Albuquerque, would make a determination of how much cannabis is being grown. Is there market equilibrium with regard to the system? And really, it's not so much to control overproduction as much as it is to protect supply for medical patients. That's really the impetus for this, right? And every 6 months, they would make the determination and say, okay, based on the number of licensed producers that we have, based on the need, based on the demand, producers could be growing, 4,000 plants at this point, right? And maybe that's a cap that's imposed. And then 6 months later, they will revisit that, right? And then over the course of 3 years, that would phase out. And it is sort of a proof of concept, right? Because ultimately, what we want to know over those first 3 years is what are the kind of tweaks that we need to make to this framework to ensure not only protections for the medical program, ensuring proper supply for medical patients, but also to ensure that the industry doesn't collapse upon itself, right? We heard many comments from interested parties during the 60-day session of what happened in Oregon, for example, right? And overproduction. Now, I've heard two sides of that story. I've heard that it wasn't a plant count, a lack of a plant count that resulted in overproduction, but rather over licensing, right? So we have these two competing sort of schools of thought, right? And that's plant count or license cap. And so we're taking both of those, and we are imposing a 3-year, essentially, market equilibrium plan to make sure that the industry gets off to a good start, to make sure that patients have adequate supply for their medical cannabis. And then after those 3 years, this thing gets phased out, right? And then at that point, you as a producer will make your own determinations based on your market and make those decisions accordingly.
Will there be, okay, so first off, when you say the concern to ensure that the medical patient supply is there, Like, that's surprising to me a little bit because first off, isn't the way in which cannabis is cultivated and produced for medical patients, isn't that process completely different than, say, rec or adult use? And then, secondly, with more people coming in the adult use side, wouldn't that just make the market bigger to allow more people to enter, to have a license to grow? And then, like, wouldn't they have to determine whether they're growing for adult use or for medical? Like,
Yeah, so we have independent testing that will take place as well, to ensure that cannabis is of proper quality. We are not. I am not of the opinion, and I know some industry folks will disagree, but I've heard both angles. I've heard industry folks say that it's very similar process up until manufacturing potentially, and I've heard folks that it's very different, very separate. I think that the way we're setting it up is it ensures that uh, as licensees plan and plot out their production, and as they plan out what they're going to push out the door through retail, that we ensure that these folks have the ability to grow and manufacture and produce products that is of medical grade for the patients. And so instead of having a sort of uh, open-ended, you know, uh, just grow what you can and sell what you can, and maybe also expecting sort of a rush, especially at first, of consumers who are going to come in and purchase adult cannabis, non-medical product, is we want to make sure that there's product available for medical patients. Again, I've heard two schools of thought on that as well. To your point, right? I've heard people say that it's a completely different process. I've heard others say it's a very similar process. Up until you get to about manufacturing, then you've got to start making different decisions there. But ultimately, when it comes to growing the plant, I'm approaching it as it being one and the same.
hmm. Okay, so and what other you were touching on maybe the other changes that we're expected to see come tomorrow, Tuesday the 30th. Um,
Yeah,
Go ahead.
yeah. So some of the other changes that we're making, for example, in the original House Bill 12, we had an entire section dealing with expungement of criminal records related to cannabis offenses. We're pulling that out of the bill and running it as a parallel bill. And the reason for that is really more insider baseball, but it's procedural. It's to ensure that the bills can go to respective committees that can vet them through their respective committee lens, if you will, right? So the goal would be to have the Cannabis Regulation Act be run through the Senate Corporations Tax Committee, which is really dealing with this brand new industry, and then to let the folks in judiciary deal with things like expungement and whatnot. Obviously, that's not it's not set in stone, right? I mean, at any point in time, leadership, both in the House and the Senate, can assign these bills really anywhere they want to assign them to. But that's one of the constructive criticisms I heard during the regular session, that the Cannabis Regulation Act, while it provided for all these entry points and whatnot for this new industry, it was also dealing heavily with criminal justice reform. And so there was a suggestion that we split them. Now, I'll tell you what, as somebody who is committed to ensuring that we legalize the right way, my expectation and sort of our mutual expectation, I think, between House and Senate leadership and the governor, is that both bills will pass and that both bills will be signed, and cannabis regulation will not pass without its without its sister bill, the expungement bill. That's one of the bigger differences too that you'll see in the bill that will hopefully come out at some point tomorrow. Other than that, with regulation and licensing fully on board and embracing the idea of legalization, they've really been super helpful in tweaking the language so that it really fits their needs as regulators. As we were writing the bill initially, we didn't have regulation and licensing at the table, not for any negative reason. We're just as the legislative branch, we were moving forward sort of on our own. And so regulation licensing came on board a little bit later in the process. So since they've been on board, they've really been helpful in, like I said, crafting the language so that they can do their job as regulators. Obviously, I'm not a regulator, never have been, don't plan on ever being one. And so some of the language is written, wasn't quite fulfilling the needs that they had. And so there's several sections where that language has been changed. Substantively, not much has changed with that language. It's more, stylistic and sort of legalese, if you will.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, well, it's encouraging to hear that they're collaborating and they're directly involved now, the licensing and regulation committee, right? Because they're an integral part of that legislation, and for them to kind of come in and write the exact language and terminology will just kind of, again, be another way to get this thing moved forward. I did read, to your point about social restorative justice and social equity components of the initial HB 12 bill. I did hear, vocal opposers like Senator, what was his name? Joe Cervantes, who's the judiciary chairman, as well as Senator Spurtle, right? I think that they were talking about how it was a little heavy on the social equity restorative justice side and not so much on the regulation side. So it's good that y'all are working together to kind of work some of that out. But, Senator Cervantes has been as vocal as to say, like, New Mexico is not ready for this yet. Like, why is he saying that?
I can't speak for him, obviously. And, I don't know what his, I don't know what his thought process is, but I do got to say this. So, I approach all my legislating. I approach my work as a legislator 100% through the lens of race and justice. I don't separate the two. Like, I don't do social justice on Thursdays and all the other stuff on Wednesdays. You know what I mean? Like, I view the world as a Mexican immigrant. I view the world as the son of two Mexican immigrants who came to this country to give me a better life, and who to this day don't really speak the English language and are still very much insulated in their own community. They're as American as anyone, as far as I'm concerned, but they still don't feel that because they don't speak the language. They're brown skinned like me. They've worked for minimum wage, they almost their entire life, and they don't really. They see the American dream through me and my sister and our kids. That's how they've experienced it. But I don't separate, the fact that my father still doesn't have health care, the fact that my mother, still lives paycheck to paycheck. I don't separate that from my life as an attorney, as a legislator, and whatnot. And so the notion that cannabis legalization can be, split, social justice bill and cannabis regulation over here, it's just ignorant. It's actually kind of stupid to think of it that way. If I'm being completely honest with you. Having said that, I've conceded the point that maybe an entire section on expungement could potentially run on its own as a piece of legislation.
Standalone legislation, right? Yeah.
Fair game. Now, obviously, there are political dynamics at play. I will not allow cannabis regulation to pass my chamber without expungement passing too, right? And I've been upfront about that. I'm not sacrificing, people's criminal records for the sake of regulating and legalizing a multi-billion-dollar industry. So, as far as I'm concerned, okay, I concede that point. Now, if you look at the rest of House Bill 12, if you look at the licensing framework, for example, social and racial justice is embedded throughout, right? When you look at the level of ease in terms of entry into the industry that we've conceived in our bill, right? The micro business licenses, fully vertically integrated micro business license. That means, where are you from? You're from Northern New Mexico?
Central, Belen, New Mexico.
Shout
out to the Eagles. Yeah.
All right. Belen High School. So that means that, if your family has a little plot of land down in Belen, but they don't have access to tons of capital, they can't go get a full out vertically integrated license, which is going to run you about $100,000. They don't have the capital to transform your chili farm into a cannabis operation. They can't get into the business. But with the micro business licenses, for a few $1,000s, I'm talking, anywhere between $3,000 and $5,000, a plot of land, access to water, and some know-how and some entrepreneurship, you all can get a fully vertically integrated license that would allow you to grow cannabis, manufacture cannabis, and have retail of cannabis, right? And that to me is one of the most important social justice aspects of this whole thing.
So
right?
I get the easy entry because I mean, like if you look at a couple $1,000 license for the micro businesses as opposed to like say over $100,000 for a commercial license, right? That is beneficial to someone who wants to get in. But I guess my question is like, there is capital that needs to be raised in this industry regardless though, right? Because like if you pay for a $2,000, $3,000 license for a micro business license, you're not going to be able to cultivate and grow with just that amount. You're going to need more capital to set up watering, water systems, lighting, perhaps whatever it is, even if it's small scale. So I'm just saying overall, this isn't an inexpensive game to enter, right?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And I actually had that question in a meeting I had this weekend with advocates about this. Absolutely true, right? But then again, when I talk about social justice and I talk about righting the wrongs of the past through a cannabis legalization bill, we've got to remember that we still exist in a capitalist society, right? And so my version of social justice might not go far enough for some people, but by golly, we're still in a capitalist society. And for any industry that this farm in Belen would want to go into, for whether it's alfalfa or green chili or apples, you're still going to need that capital to make that happen.
Right.
The point of our bill is to say, look, if we follow the lead of some of these other states, all we've got to do is say, all right, here's a vertically integrated license. It's $150,000 per year. And if you want to enter the industry, that's the entry point. That means most of our communities here in New Mexico will not be able to enter, except for a select few and some out-of-staters, right? But by creating this entry point into the industry, yes, no doubt, you still need capital above and beyond the $3,000 that the license is going to cost you, but at least we're ensuring that you can get in. Now, I'll make another point real quick too. In previous versions of the bill, we had prohibitions against outside money coming in. You had to be from New Mexico to get a license. But then I did some reflecting on that, right? It sounds great. It sounds like a great progressive, like, screw the man and let's let New Mexicans have their own industry.
New Mexico first.
Let's go back to that example, right, of your family farm in Belen, okay? Let's say that the family wants to go in. They don't have the capital to go in big, so they're going to go in through the micro license. And let's assume they have the $3,000 for the license, but they don't have the $20,000 for everything else. Okay.
Right.
But let's assume that you have a cousin who made it big in California or DC or Texas or wherever. And let's say that cousin is really invested in what you guys are doing and he thinks it's really cool. And he wants to invest the $20,000. Under my previous bill, House Bill 356, 2019, you couldn't have gotten a license with that kind of investment from a so-called outsider. Under this version of the bill, you can absolutely get that investment from your cousin and start your micro business operation. So, as we look at the social justice components of this bill, there will always be folks who will say it doesn't go far enough. This has to be more bold. And I've got to remind them, this is still a capitalist society, and this new industry is no different from any other industry. It is capitalist to the core, and it requires capital in order to get off the ground, right? Mm-hmm. But that's not something that I will necessarily be able to resolve with this one bill when when that access to capital is really an issue that spans any industry.
Right.
I mean, any industry you want to talk about, any business you want to start up from the ground, you're going to need access to that capital. Having said that, assuming this bill passes, assuming the governor signs it, I am fully committed to not walking away from cannabis legalization once it's legalized. I've said it time and time again, this framework will have to be improved upon every single year. It will. There's no doubt about it. And whoever says that it's not, they're foolish. We do have to improve on it.
Sure, of course.
One of the
Just like
improvements I want to
anything.
see,
Yeah.
yeah, one of the improvements I want to see is to ensure that the tax revenues that are generated by this industry are invested in targeted communities. So a previous iteration of my bill, this is actually another one of the changes, was we created 8 different earmarks for the funding. Everything from roadside safety to an equity fund to help small startups with access to capital, right? Unfortunately, we had to remove those earmarks because the legislature here doesn't look very favorably. Even some of the most progressive champions don't look very favorably, earmarking revenues, because what it does is it ties the hands of the appropriators, 10 years down the road. And I get it. I mean, it's I serve on one of those appropriations committees, and when everything is set in stone and statute, then what's your job at that point, right? It's all, the money's appropriated already automatically. But one of the commitments that I've made is to ensure that those revenues are invested in strategic places, and a rural equity fund to ensure that communities in rural New Mexico who have land, have water, have the know-how, but don't have the capital, can actually access some affordable capital to start their cannabis business. And that's something that I'm very optimistic will happen probably in the 30-day session, in January.
And that's one kind of area where the tax revenue will be funneled, but I would assume also into like education programs in those rural areas, infrastructure for streets. Like, is that also where the tax money is going to be going? Or,
if you look at previous versions of the bill, we were looking at a community reinvestment fund to help support young people of color throughout the state in a number of ways. We were looking at roadside safety through the Department of Public Safety. We were looking at a rural equity fund, which would be sort of startup money. We were looking at a patient subsidy fund to help subsidize the medicine of medical cannabis patients. And then there were a number of others. We did not tie up money into like public education or infrastructure, understanding that those are decisions that the appropriating committees need to make, right? So if you look at like education funding in New Mexico, it operates very differently than I think most any other state, because we have a state equalization formula that ensures that our school funding is not based on property taxes the way other places are, right? So schools in Belen get their fair share as schools in the Northeast Heights, the expensive part of Albuquerque. Like, the money follows the student essentially. So, if Belen has lower property tax, that doesn't mean Belen schools get less money like in other places, right? So from that perspective, it's probably not a very good idea to earmark cannabis money into education like the way they did in Colorado, for example, because quite frankly, we don't really need to do that. We have the capacity to fund education through several other sources. Now, if the legislature made the decision at any given year to say, okay, cannabis is bringing in an additional $400 million a year in revenues, we're going to increase education funding this year and the next 5 years. But that's different than earmarking, right? That's an appropriation that would be made year to year.
And that's what I hope happens because like I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, like I'm a New Mexico native, right? We know the areas in which New Mexico falls behind, education being one. And we've seen in neighboring states, other states, how much tax revenue cannabis brings in, recreational cannabis, right? And most of those states are funneling to those different causes or the infrastructure, the education. And so it seems like it might be a missed opportunity if that money isn't put back into places where we can invest in our young people, right? and start to move the needle when it comes to education and other things. One thing I want to circle back on with you, Representative Martinez, is your comments about, which I totally agree, when you talk about like, look, we want entry, we want anybody to kind of enter into this space and get a fair shot. We live in a capitalist society, so let's kind of let capitalism let the dust settle, right? Because there's going to be winners, there's going to be losers. Um, One thing that I see though that could potentially happen, and this goes back to the 2018 Farm Bill that was passed, right? Like mass cultivation of hemp throughout the country. And as we've seen that play out with lack of enforcement, right? Is that we've seen saturation in the market, especially when it comes to hemp. And I know that New Mexico has been a state that's been a victim of that. Texas, we're living in it right now, right? You got all these producers that are growing hemp, and there's not enough people to buy it, and there's not enough processing plants to get it processed and extracted for oils and topicals and all that kind of stuff. So how do we ensure that the industry as a whole in New Mexico thrives with more producers coming online than consumers?
Well, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons we have this this compromise on plant and license caps. This market equilibrium idea that really, I think is designed to address some of those concerns. Again, we heard from two sides, right? We heard people. The people who completely oppose any type of limitation were usually people who were medical patients saying, wait a minute, if you start tinkering, we're going to lose out. We're not going to have access to medicine. There's a very active and outspoken medical cannabis patient group that made it very clear from the beginning. And in fact, they were super supportive of House Bill 12 initially because we didn't have any caps. And then once this language was inserted, I think they really felt like, their concerns were back on the table, about artificially capping. On the other side, you had folks from the industry, the current industry, saying, wait a minute, look at Oregon, the bottom fell out. We had overproduction, we have oversaturation. The reality is that both of those concerns are legitimate, and that's why we came up with the language that we came up with. For those 3 years, we're going to allow the regulators through the work of the advisory committee to come up and determine, to ensure that the market is stable. Totally anti-capitalist, totally state-driven at that point, right, in a way. But it's only for 3 years, right? And after that, then we're going to open it up. Now, could there be an oversaturation and not enough consumers? Absolutely. I mean, I think New Mexico, as you know, is a relatively small state. In some of the research that I saw over the summer on this topic, it was estimated that upwards of 35-40% of consumers would actually be out of staters. It would be people from Texas, probably primarily coming in to partake in the industry. And so much, I think so much of that activity will be driven by that kind of tourism across the border, across state lines. But yeah, I mean, look, we could be back here in 4 years seeing an oversaturation potentially. I mean, that's a possibility. Or we could be back here in 4 years and New Mexico might be the cream of the crop when it comes to legalization. Although I'll tell you what, I mean, I read an article and I hadn't really thought of it this way, but if New Mexico does legalize, essentially the entire Southwest will have legalized at that point, with California, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, right. With Texas kind of being the red line there, if you will.
Right.
So it's a very interesting time, I think, for this issue. If the federal government moves forward, and that's really sort of another big picture concept that I think is worth noting. To my previous points of New Mexico being a spec in this larger context, should the federal government legalize cannabis in the next few years, a state like New Mexico can kind of wait for that to happen and then figure out where we fit in the equation, which I feel is kind of like what we end up doing all the time anyway. Or we can take the plunge, understanding that there'll be headaches, understanding that it will not be fully equitable, because we're still in an inequitable society, period. Case in point, look at COVID deaths and look at COVID vaccination rates and look at everything related to that pandemic. And so, the best we could do is be as equitable as we possibly can be in that context. And when the federal government legalizes, we're well on our way.
Mm-hmm.
And not only that, but we're on our way with a framework that I think people like us can agree to and say, okay, this isn't just a money-making venture for rich people. This is actually an industry that we get to shape from start. We didn't get to do that with the oil and gas industry in New Mexico. We didn't get to do that with the agricultural industry in New Mexico, right? Those industries kind of came, took root, and now we're reacting to them. With cannabis legalization, we can actually set the rules in a way that we're comfortable with, and then see how that plays out into the future.
Right. So I do want to talk about, there's a lot of talk in the financial markets of the multi-state operators in different parts of the country, right? You've got the Northeastern operators, you've got the West Coast operators. And with HB 12, I know that you mentioned the initial draft that, you had to revise it and allow for capital from other states and, outside states. And that's allowed now. But when it comes to these multi-state operators, do they have any opportunity to enter in, or what does it look like? Is it all going to be kind of the state operators within New Mexico that will grow, or where do the MSOs fit in, if at all?
So in the bill, we are requesting that licensing and regulation department come up with rules to as they come up with the licensing infrastructure, right? And among those rules are plans to ensure that there's diversity in licensing, and to ensure that people from underrepresented communities in New Mexico are licensed. So, I would find it hard. I would find it hard to believe that we would have some sort of big influx of outsiders and all of them getting licensed ahead of local people. Local people will, for all intents and purposes, kind of get a leg up in the process, because we are asking that division to come up with rules and regulations that reflect that. They got to have plans in place to ensure that folks from Belen or Rio Arriba County or Doña Ana County are not last in line to folks from California or Colorado moving in. Now, there's a very real concern that I have, that if I'm land rich and cash poor, that I'll just lease out my land and let some guy from Colorado come in and do his thing. Yeah, that's there's potential for that, and back to one of the earlier comments that you asked, questions that you asked me about, one of the senators saying that New Mexico wasn't ready. I've heard that within the context of people being land rich, cash poor, and speculators coming in and either buying up your land or whatever. But there's also a terribly paternalistic view at that point, right? Who am I to say that my neighbor, I live in the North Valley of Albuquerque, if you're familiar with it, people are land rich and cash poor. Who am I to tell my neighbor, that land that's been in your family forever and it is now worth $500,000, don't sell it.
Right.
At some point, right? At some point, people make their own decisions based on their economic reality. So, we are taking every step available to us to ensure that local communities can enter the industry through easy access into it. We are taking every step possible in the licensing system to ensure that rural New Mexicans and people of color and others have a leg up in that process. But ultimately, you will have out-of-state operators. In some cases, maybe there'll be investors in your small family operation, which would be fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
In other cases, they'll come in and just want to buy up your land.
Right.
And people will make their own decisions at that point.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. I want to touch on very quickly. We touched a little bit about the tax revenue coming in. You clarified that the money's not earmarked for public education and other things, but if there's added tax revenue, then they may consider bringing that into public education. You talked about how some of the tax revenue will be secured for low socioeconomic rural areas, right? For disadvantaged families and whatnot. And so when I'm looking here, the projected revenue for the first year of HB 12, if it passes, is $318 million. So where will the money be funneled in other areas?
Yeah, well, the chart that you're looking at there, I think it's 318 million, and then I think the other number I've seen is maybe closer to 50 to 80 million in year one. So it's kind of all over the place, and that's why I haven't not led this movement through the lens of like, this is a cash cow for New Mexico. Let's do it because we're going to have money raining on us, right? The reality is we don't really know. I think ultimately based on what we've seen. Like I said, I've seen everywhere from 50 million in revenue to 300 million in revenue to 600 million in revenue. That's one of the issues we've had with earmarking the funds, right? Essentially, we're creating a pie, and at the same time, we were trying to divvy up that pie. And I can tell you, again, going back to education and going back to infrastructure, I'm not convinced that those two very critical points in our state, I'm not convinced that those 2 points don't have funding sources that are already available. Again, for schools, you've got the school equalization formula. You've got a 5% distribution from the Land Grant Permanent Fund, which we just now approved to increase to 5.5% of the Land Grant Permanent Fund, which is a $22 billion equity fund that New Mexico generates out of royalties from oil and gas and by investing it in Wall Street. And so, that's on average a few $100 million into public education alone, plus the general fund appropriations that are made every year. Now, when it comes to infrastructure, we have the Severance Tax Permanent Fund, which is another big fund that we have that funds critical projects like school building, construction, infrastructure, water systems, roads, and whatnot. So those two entities, I believe, and there's a philosophical debate to be had about whether or not we fund enough. That's always the question every session, right? Mm-hmm. And I would argue that we should be investing more, just out of my perspective. But also, it's not because we don't have funds available to pay for those things. So earmarking cannabis revenues from the get-go, and saying, okay, this much for education, this much for infrastructure, this much for Medicaid and behavioral health, I'm not convinced that's the right approach, especially not knowing really how much this industry will create in revenue for New Mexico. If it's $50 million and you're divvying it up 9 different ways, then, that's probably chump change for any of those agencies, right? If it's 600 million, then, the dynamic's a little different. So my approach, first of all, with the bill that we will debate tomorrow, there are no earmarks. Like I said, there are no funds being created. This is straight up legalization framework. Hopefully we pass it and it's done. And then as we come back in the next 1, 2, 3 sessions.
So if it's not earmarked, then who gets that money then, though? Like, it goes somewhere, right?
Yeah. So it's no different than any other gross receipts tax or excise tax. It all goes into the state's general fund. Okay. That general fund is then appropriated every year by the appropriating committees of the legislature, right? So I serve on the interim legislative finance committee, which is the committee. It's bipartisan, bicameral, and we work over the course of the spring, summer, and fall, building the budget for the following year. And we build the budget in conjunction with all of these agencies: the Public Education Department, the Early Childhood and Care Department, the Health and Human Services Department, Corrections, you name it. We work in conjunction with those agencies. And then as we go into the next legislative session that following winter, we have a budget framework, right? Which will say, okay, the Public Education Department this year will get, it's roughly 50% of our state budget, right? So they will be getting, $4 billion. And that's based on analyses between analysts on both sides, both the Public Education Department and the Legislative Finance Committee. This money that is generated goes into that general fund. And then we make the decisions of how that money is appropriated based on the needs, based on the asks of the agencies, based on how much more money we have available, based on what new initiatives we passed that previous year. So like this this previous year, we passed the Family Equity Index, which essentially means more money and services into specific communities within the public schools, right? This is a really cool, I think, idea by the education department and the governor to ensure that kids in communities of high need receive more money for more services. And so I suspect in the years to come, the ask from the public education department will be a little bit higher, right?
Mhm.
And so this money, along with any other money that comes in, whether it's oil and gas or other agricultural products or gasoline or gross receipts tax, which is our version of the sales tax, all that money comes into this big pot and then we appropriate. Now, I am interested in the coming session in creating specific funds like the Rural Equity Fund, right? To say, okay, we have an opportunity for rural communities to enter this cannabis industry, but we know that there is a lack of access to capital. Like, I don't think anybody can deny that. So I would like to see a fund created. And once that fund is created, I would like to see the legislature fund that fund out of general fund money. Now, money's fungible, right? So can you really track a dollar that comes in through taxes specifically to cannabis? I mean, you can track it on a chart, but ultimately that dollar could very well be an oil and gas dollar too at the end of the day when you spend it, right?
Right.
So the idea would be to say, okay, here's the Rural Equity Fund, which we don't have. We could create it out of the Economic Development Department. We could tell the Economic Development Department, this is going to be for money to provide low interest loans to rural community operations dealing in cannabis, right? And then the legislature would appropriate $5 million or however much every year, right? And then that particular agency would then be tasked with creating the rules and whatnot for how to apply for these loans. And then they would open up for business so that communities who want entry into cannabis industry, they'll be able to get in through the microbusiness license. But if they have a $15,000 need for capital investment to buy the greenhouses and the drip systems, they could arguably go apply for that loan with the Economic Development Department.
That seems
Low
like
interest.
that would be like super beneficial, like in addition to that, rural equity community program that you're mentioning, because that's the inevitable next step, right? Is to have
That's
the
right.
resources and tools and everything that you'd need to fund a cannabis operation, if in fact that's what you wanted to do,
That, you're absolutely right. And look, if we do this interview again next year, I guarantee you there'll be folks saying, well, why is it a loan? It should be a grant, right? Because people are always trying to like.
Well, you can't, I
push
mean,
it
you
as-
can't, yeah, you can't please everyone. And I understand, like, it's, there's a progressive movement happening and people want, a lot of these wrongs written right. And, and so, but to find that balance, when there's, partisanship and whatnot, it's tough. It's political, right? At that point,
It is tough. And I appreciate you mentioning that, because this isn't the, people think that Democrats control the House, the Senate, and the governor's office, and we can just ram things through. Well, our Democrats, run the gamut from conservative to very progressive. I'm on the very progressive side. But I'm also like, I came up as a community organizer, and a lot of people say they're organizers because they worked in politics, but like, I'm a legitimate, real community organizer, man. Like, I to this day, that's my day job. And what does that mean? Well, it means that you've got to be pragmatic. There's a world as it is, and there's a world as it should be. And I'm always thinking of the world as it should be. That's why I consider myself a progressive liberal, unabashed, right? But at the same time, when I'm in the legislature, I'm dealing with 111 other people who have their own ideas and their own convictions. And case in point, I will refer you to an article that came out yesterday in the New York Times about Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro and Senator Patty Murray, and how those two liberal champions who have been in Congress for like 30 years were able to get into the American Rescue Plan, one of the most transformative pieces of law that we will probably be talking about for the next 50 years. And that is the Earned Income Child Tax Credit, and how they devised the framework to ensure that these families essentially get a monthly check for their kids. It's like Social Security benefits for little kids, right? And if you're reading this article, like, yeah, these ladies are champions. Like, they're unabashedly like, liberal, but at the same time, you're working within this system, and you've got to be able to leverage relationships and make your case oftentimes to very conservative members of your own party, that this is the right thing to do. And oftentimes what it means is that you've got to take some like baby steps in a way,
Right.
right?
And
Like you've got to
sometimes,
build
yeah.
enough comfort.
Right. And sometimes
You
not
know,
even so conservative, right? I mean, you even got moderate Democrats where there's opposition with moderate Democrats and progressive Democrats, right? So I think
that's
that
right.
even overall, like even at the federal level, I think that that's going to be the big challenge in not only reform but eventual legislation is the conservative, moderate Democrats, collaborating and working with the progressive Democrats to get this done. Because as we know, of course, the House and the Senate and the presidential office is Democrat, right? And then you've got New Mexico, which is a primarily blue state. So it is a challenge, but to your point, like we got to kind of meet in the middle here and get this thing across the finish line, and then evolve it as it grows, because no one's going to get it perfect right away, just like
That's
anything.
right.
Yeah.
That's absolutely right. And look, you know, the American Rescue Plan, a lot of people, myself included, were frustrated that we couldn't get a $15 an hour minimum wage. Absolutely, we're frustrated, especially that, like we couldn't hold those 5 or 6 Democrats to just do it and do right by the American people. Does that mean I tank the entire American Rescue Plan? Does that mean I don't vote for the people who voted for it? Does that mean if I'm a member of Congress that I completely blow it up? My goodness, there's so much good in it, including this very radical, empowering plan to uplift children out of poverty, right? But that stuff gets lost in the noise of we didn't get the $15 an hour minimum wage. Well, yes, we didn't, and it stinks that we didn't, and we're going to keep fighting for it. But look at what we did get. We got radically important stuff in that bill. I kind of feel the same way about this cannabis bill. Are we getting everything we want? No, we're not. But we're also operating in the world as it is. And New Mexico, if we legalize in the next week or so, will be one of the most progressive legalization frameworks in the country. And that's saying a lot for, that little speck that I talked about earlier. New Mexico can actually be a bright, shining light for other states that are considering legalization, and doing it the right way.
It's a perfect segue. So to wrap up, Representative Martinez, if you pull out your crystal ball, tomorrow's the day. What happens with HB 12 and the overall landscape of cannabis legalization in New Mexico?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, for your viewers or your listeners, I should say, don't look for HB 12 anymore. That bill is dead. So it'll have a new number. I don't know what the number will be, but it'll be a new number.
Okay.
It's
still yours, though. It's still the one you're co-sponsoring, right? Or is
it's still our bill.
Okay.
It's a bill that will be sponsored by myself and Andrea Romero out of Santa Fe and Debbie Armstrong out of Albuquerque, Senators Ortiz y Pino, Linda Lopez, and Katie Duhigg, all of them from Albuquerque. And we start tomorrow, and the bill will go through its committee process, and it'll be a tough, long, fight. And we expect it to last, a couple of days. That's just the way the process works. It's got to go through the House committees, House floor, Senate committees, Senate floor, and then it goes up to the governor. So my prediction, I don't like to predict on legislation. I don't even like to bet on baseball games or anything of that sort. But I'll tell you what, I'm feeling confident, and I'm feeling very energized to get this done, because I really believe to my core that this will be one of the best legalization frameworks that this country has seen. And as I said that to a reporter yesterday, I realized, holy cow, I bet you this is one of the most progressive legalization frameworks in the entire world. I doubt the Netherlands did it this way. We know Mexico's about to legalize. I doubt that they're legalizing through a racial justice perspective. As a Mexicano, I can tell you we've got a lot of work to do south of the border on race issues. Mm-hmm. New Mexico actually could be a world leader in legalization frameworks that really respect the rights of people who have been criminalized and subjected to these racist, oppressive drug laws.
Well, it's going to be interesting and exciting to see it play out. Representative Martinez, really appreciate your time today. I know how busy you are and the rest of the legislators trying to get this thing passed. So Like you said, let's get it done, man. It's going to be a good thing for New Mexico as a state. And like you said, it could be a way to put them on the map in terms of, the way in which they're going about regulation.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate the time.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you all so much for listening. We'll talk to you later. Bye.